Hi, this is Shane Morris. As we approach our fiscal year end here at the Colson Center, would you help us continue to equip individuals and institutions to bring restoration to their spheres of influence? You can support this work by giving at colsoncenter.org/FYE23. Welcome to Upstream, where we make your worldview bigger and older by taking hard questions to the headsprings of Christian wisdom. I'm Shane Morris. If you know me, you know I love God's creation and have since I was a kid. From insect wings and oak trees to bottlenose dolphins and dinosaurs, I've always taken joy in observing, learning about, drawing, and sharing the endless beauty of God's living world. So I've always been confused and troubled by a reaction I often hear among Christians when the topics of conservation and the environment come up. There's a dismissiveness, a sense that these are left-wing concerns. Often I'll hear people say that God gave us this world to use, and humans are more important than nature, and it's all going to burn up in the end anyway. There are a lot of theological assumptions and implications behind these remarks, and they raise an even more important question. Does God care about the environment? And if he does, well, why don't we? Today, I welcome someone to the show who shares my passion for the created world, as well as my confusion when Christians dismiss or downplay it. Xandra Carroll is a speaker, author, and Christian voice on biology and the environment. She holds a master's degree in conservation biology from Victoria University of Wellington, and her research has included work on parasitology, flow cytometry, and ecological restoration. She's lived and researched abroad in Asia, Africa, New Zealand, and the UK, and is passionate about educating Christians on our role as stewards of God's natural world. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Xandra Carroll, welcome to Upstream.
Thank you so much for having me on your show. It's a real honor.
Well, first of all, tell us about yourself. How did you become fascinated with biology and conservation and become the, it seems to me, kind of rare breed that you are as a Christian conservationist?
Yeah, rare breed indeed. We are hard to find, sadly. Well, I think it started from a very young age, my love for the environment and all the interesting little creepy crawlies underfoot. I grew up in San Diego, and my dad was one of those fathers who does not rush through the day or rush through a walk. He's ready to stop and stoop down and look at an interesting little grasshopper or stop and listen to a bird singing in a tree. And I wonder now how much that kind of pushed me into the field that I'm in now. I'm very grateful for just his character of wanting to slow down and say, look at what God made. Look at this amazing little treasure that we were about to walk right by. So that's, I think, where my love of biology started. But you asked a good question about, that rare combination of getting interested in theology and philosophy and also holding on to this scientific background. And that really came out of, I think, a crucible for me in graduate school when I was faced with this claim that was coming at me from every direction that you can't do both. In fact, the first book that I opened when I was studying during my master's degree was this Handbook of Ecological Restoration, and I was going to read it cover to cover. And in the introduction on page 3, it warns you to beware of the Judeo-Christian worldview because it shows no sign of kindness or respect for the environment. So here I am sitting in the library, my first week starting my master's degree, and I read this and I stop and think to myself, wait a minute, did I just get into the wrong field? I moved all the way to New Zealand and spent every penny I had to come and study conservation and become a conservationist. So I really had to wrestle through that of, am I allowed to be involved? And that whole process of learning, studying, praying, seeking, wondering, and questioning led me to the conclusion that the Christian perspective offers something to the conservation conversation that no other worldview can. And I think not only should we be allowed to the table, but we have to come to the table for the sake of environmentalism because other people out there are getting it wrong and don't have the right answers, in my opinion, philosophically speaking.
I know it's a big question, but why do you think that is? What's going on that a remark like that at the beginning of a textbook could make some kind of sense to people, that people would read that and go, yeah, those Christians, those Judeo-Christian types, they just disregard the environment?
It's a great question, Shane. And I wonder if so much of it comes back to wording in Genesis. In this particular text that I referenced, that Handbook of Ecological Restoration, they allude to Genesis where God commands Adam and Eve to have dominion over the earth. And they say, they just want to use it up. They don't care about it. This is why we have to stay away from this worldview. And it was sort of insinuating, don't let them to the table. Don't let them get involved in this. And I think even Christians have misunderstood that as well. That statement that we are meant to go out and have dominion over the created world. I think there's misunderstanding on both sides of the argument personally. And one of the things that I try to do as a speaker and writer is correct that.
So I do want to talk about the misunderstandings and how we can better interpret that, as well as other scriptural and theological underpinnings of the way we look at the environment. Because, spoiler alert, you and I do not think that the Judeo-Christian view is sort of uniquely hostile to the care and preservation of God's world. That's precisely why we care, is because it's God's world. But before we get there, what are some of the manifestations that you've seen of this Christian indifference toward the environment? You mentioned a few in the podcast that you did with Lighten, which was the thing that prompted me to ask you on the show. What are some of the things people say? What are the attitudes? And then, I guess, give us your steel man of those complaints. Like, what are people trying to say when they give us this dismissals?
Yeah, that's a great question, Shane. And I know there are a lot out there, but I'll just speak from my perspective personally of what I hear at the end of a talk or something when a Christian comes up to me and says, "Oh, you poor thing, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but you haven't read your Bible and you don't realize that this is all going to burn up and you shouldn't waste your time trying to save whatever animal or keep whatever rainforest from burning down." So that is one of them, that, God made this earth for us. It's for our consumption, and it's all here for us, and we can use it however we wish. And at the end, everything's going to burn up and be rolled up like a scroll, and he's going to make a new earth. But the Lord never says that in the Bible. My dear friend, Nathan Rittenhouse, who I know you've also had on this podcast, is very fond of saying that
great guy.
He's a great guy, and he's got a great beard. He often says that the Lord is not going to make all new things. He's not going to just throw everything away and make a new one. He's going to renew what's already been made. And that picture of renewal, that picture of restoration is at the heart of the Christian message. It does not just apply to you and I, Shane. It applies to the earth. It applies to all of creation, that it's precious in God's sight. He's not just going to throw it away, but he wants to restore. And so I think there's a reason why when we look at trashed beaches and whales that are starving because they've eaten so much plastic and just washed up on shore and died, our heart breaks, because I think intrinsically we know that it's not meant to be this way and that it grieves the Lord. So I don't think it's a good argument. Another thing that people say is, well, God made the earth perfectly and we can't mess it up. It's going to rebalance itself. Like, we are not big enough or strong enough to cause some sort of imbalance. We're just little specks on the earth or something like that. But I think that does a great disservice to history. I mean, we know that humans have an effect on the climate. We've created micro ice ages multiple times. You look at London, Victorian age London, where they were burning coal and created their own micro ice age. It was terrible. And also, again, coming back to the scriptures, that's what I always say. Is that what the Bible says? Or is that what people are saying? Or is that what your pastor said from the pulpit? I always want to go straight back to the word, because in the Old Testament, we see people being judged by God dependent upon how they treated their livestock, how they treated the earth. So God takes it very seriously, and we give an account for how we steward. Other people will almost like fly in the face of God's judgment, which is kind of funny to hear Christians say, but, he's not going to flood the earth again. Like, he's not going to, so he wouldn't allow us to destroy the earth. He's not going to allow it to be destroyed in any way, shape, or form. But interestingly, if you read really carefully in that Genesis account of Noah's Ark, God specifically says to Noah that he's meant to keep the animals. He says, you're meant to keep them, not just let them go out of the ark, but meant to keep them alive. And I think that applies not just to the animals that were on the ark, but all of creation. That shows the heart of God, that we as his stewards are meant to actively cause those things to exist, is what that Hebrew causative clause means. It's an active clause. And I could go on forever, but I'll just mention one last one, which I think you've probably also heard, which is that environmentalism is actually evil because it's people worshiping creation. It's almost like a form of animism that's creeping into Christendom, and we have to be very aware of this. It's bad for our kids, is whatever. But coming back to the scriptures again, which say that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. So we honor the earth because it belongs to God. Environmentalism is a form of worship. They got that right, but they were wrong about what it's worshiping. Environmentalism is not worship of the environment. Environmentalism is worship of the Creator. It's when we turn to God and say, you are worth the sacrifice of my time and my comfort to care about the things that you care about, God. You are worth it to me. And so environmentalism, I think, is a beautiful act of worship that we can offer before the Lord. And there are certainly right ways and wrong ways of doing that, but we can talk more about that later. Yeah.
I love that list. It's a very, very comprehensive and effective, description or summary of the kinds of objections you get. And I recognize all of those. I think many of my listeners will recognize those as well. Maybe they've raised some of those objections. And if I am, like I said a moment ago, steel manning them, if I'm presenting the strongest version, particularly of that last one, the idea that environmentalism is a kind of religion. And I do think it's inarguable that there are strains of the environmentalist movement, the secular manifestation of this idea, that does exhibit signs of almost a pagan religiosity, of just being as crazy as Christians and conservatives think that it is. And so you get things like people will recognize these images, folks doing protest where they're sort of like apologizing to the trees or something, the more like eco-terrorism, things like that. You get these manifestations of the weirdness and the craziness. And I think a lot of people, or just the general sense of like mindless panic over this or that impending environmental disaster, right? And I think Christians look at this and they go, well, number one, they think that must be representative of the whole thing, and there must not really be any other way to do it, right? But number two, all of that because there's something intrinsic in caring for the creation or the environment, however someone wants to put that, that leads you into this environment worship, this worship of the creation rather than the creator, as Romans puts it. And I think that's where the caution comes from. And I do understand the sense of like caution, or even, I guess, recoiling from some of the extreme manifestations that you do see in secular manifestations of environmentalism, right? I get that. But I think the thing we need to do now is interrogate that, ask whether is there something intrinsic in caring for the earth that causes you to go this direction? Or is it possible to do it as a theist, as a Christian, as someone who puts God in the place of sole object of worship, not nature, and certainly not human beings?
Yeah, I read a really interesting paper recently that talked about the different motivations for conservation. I found it really interesting, and they were talking about the guilt and the fear and the self-preservation and all these things, and almost like it can become, for some people, almost a form of religious atonement, where they are trying to pay for the sins of past generations or of their own generation, and so you go out and you clean up a beach, not because you necessarily only want the beach clean. Certainly that's a byproduct of that, but because it's almost a religious act of, it's almost like a self-flagellation of, oh no, look at me, I used some plastic to make myself feel better. I need to go clean up a beach. And it is at bottom, again, self-serving, as any religion that does not have Christ at the center will just end up curving around the self. its core incurvatus ad se in Latin, basically, is this theological idea that if you don't have God at the center, it's just going to end up becoming a self-serving thing. And you see that with the environmental movement, that is that particular flavor that you're describing, the religious self-serving type of environmentalism. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we recognize that there is a reaction, but we think it's an overreaction. At least that's what I'm picking up here and have since I started watching and listening to your stuff. So why is it an overreaction? And the question within the question there is, does God care about the environment? Because if he does, obviously we should. But we've got these, you threw out some, I guess, theological, biblical reasons that people have in their heads for why it doesn't really matter, for why they don't have to care about the environment. And perhaps God doesn't really care about it. Anyway, how do we know he cares? And then we'll talk about those scriptural misgivings.
Yeah. I do want to answer why does he care, but I want to backtrack, if I may, just slightly. So I personally don't believe that we are seeing an overreaction to our environmental crisis, but I 100% believe it's a reaction in the wrong direction. So I think people are reacting as strongly as they should be, but completely to the wrong things, because I think we're facing this disgraceful episode of Lysenkoism in our modern moment, where people are reading things that are purported to be scientific, but actually are not. And a lot of climate scientists and conservationists are trying to, publish papers and address the public and say, hey, these things that you're hearing on, the evening news are actually not true at all. Here's what the data shows. But a lot of people don't hear that side. So I do think that we should react very strongly and very swiftly, but I think we have way more things to worry about than just our carbon footprint. And we can talk more about that later, but I just wanted to put a pebble in your shoe for later if you wish. So yes, God absolutely does care about the environment. And the reason that I know is because of the scriptures. You're going to get so tired of hearing me say that. But when you come back to the word and you read about his heart for creation, you read a God who says that his creation is beautiful long before humans are ever on the scene. And when we go out into the world and as we build these telescopes that can see deeper into space, we realize he has made so much beauty in this world that we will never see. It can't just be for us. It must be that he loves it and loves to create it and care for it and enjoy it. So it goes so much deeper than our experience, Shane. We're talking about the mind of God here that we cannot fathom. So he cares for all of his creation. And of course, he cares for the earth. I think he cares for the earth, especially because his beloved children are there. And he's created it in such a way that tells us it's incredibly special. I mean, the Kepler mission discovered many different systems. There's over 2,000 planets that were confirmed by that mission. And we haven't seen anything anywhere close to where we're sitting now. So that tells me that it is a very special place. I mean, I was reading just Jonah the other day. I've been reading through the Minor Prophets, and I was so fascinated when I got to the very end of Jonah. I had never picked up on this until the other day, that when God is explaining to Jonah the reason that he's not going to destroy Nineveh, he's basically giving his final apologetic to Jonah for why he's not going to destroy Nineveh. And the very last thing he says is that he sees all the many cattle that are there. And that's how the book ends. It's kind of a funny way to end. But again, it shows me God doesn't just care about the people on this planet. He cares about the animals. He cares about all of it, all of his creation. And we bear the imago Dei. We bear the image of God. And therefore, we should care about the things that God cares about. And if I come away from the scriptures convinced that God cares deeply for the earth, he cares deeply for his creation, I should as well.
That was beautifully put. I think there's this sense that a lot of Christians have that the reason God cares about the environment is about his creation is because it's all for us. So there is this, what's been called anthropocentrism, the idea that, humans are the center. And this is a fine line to walk, because on the one hand, Scripture and Christian tradition both unequivocally affirm that human beings are the pinnacle of creation. We're the thing that God actually says is in his own image, bears his likeness, occupies a role within the broader creation that represents him. In other words, we are his vice regents, as I've heard it put many times. And what that means is that we're not just another animal. We're not just a part of the ecosystem. We are, in a sense, governors or stewards, is a great way to put it, of this world that God has created. But at the same time, and when you mention the distant planets and the beauty that we're only beginning to discover, you do have to recognize that human beings were not the beginning of creation. We didn't come on the scene until day 6, right? And there's sort of a crowning motif there. But God's appraisal of creation and his filling it with beauty and majesty and form and wonder and art, it unfolds for the prior 5 days of creation at that point. And on each juncture, he says, it's good, it's good, it's good. His assessment of creation without human beings, by the way, is that it's good in and of itself. And so it seems to me that God has this love for his creation just by virtue of the fact that it is his and that it's excellent and well made. He doesn't have to read it through the lens of human beings and human well-being in order to have that appreciation for his own handiwork. And that's humbling because, well, it reminds us, first of all, that we're dust and we're only stewards by God's good decree, not because of some excellence within ourselves. But it also reminds us that he cares about this place. We should care about it too. And I think that's a perspective that it looks obvious when you just back up, read the text, and think about it. But many people miss it, perhaps because of the way they've been conditioned or just because of the cultural blinders that we wear when we approach the text. But yeah, what do you think about that? I mean, that seems to me to endorse a non-anthropocentrism in theology.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. And I'm wondering now if part of that theology that really emphasizes the crown, as you say, the pinnacle of creation as being us, is coming against this idea of Darwinian macroevolution, that we are just another animal, that we evolved from an ape-like predecessor. And so I think many Christians would try to combat that by saying, oh no, look at the scriptures. The scriptures say we are special, we're a pinnacle of creation, and therefore we're not just a hairless ape, as some people would say.
Or a featherless biped, as Plato put it, right?
There you go. But as we see again and again in philosophy, you can swing that pendulum too far in the other direction and all of a sudden say, look at us, we're like God. Not necessarily meaning to at the beginning, but saying, we're so high above creation. So what if I squash this ant that's just walking along? It doesn't matter. I am human. Hear me roar. I'm the pinnacle of God's creation. And you can't go that far either. As the theologian Ken Boa often says, we are amphibious creatures. We are amphibious. We are spiritual and we are animal. We are made of dust. He made us with the same stuff that he made all those other animals with on the same day that he made us. We didn't even get our own day. But he gave us his image, which he never gave to any of his other creatures. And so, yes, there is this spiritual component that sets us above, but we can't let go of either one. We've got to remember that we are amphibious creatures who, yes, God has raised us up and we are spiritual, but at the same time, we're just creatures down here walking around in the dust, breathing the same air. When we die, we're going to decompose. Worms are going to eat our flesh. That's how it is. I'm sorry, it's gross, but that's how it is. We are creatures. We are like animals. So I think holding on to both is good. That's maybe a bit of a long answer to your question. And then we're asking me about anthropocentrism specifically. I'm trying to remember that.
Yeah. So anthropocentrism. It's
anthropocentrism. It's quite hard.
Okay. There we go. All right. It means people-centric, right?
Yeah.
Man-centric. So this is an idea that you did discuss in one of the other contexts that I was looking at. And it's an idea that's been batted around by, secular and Christian thinkers and sort of criticized. And I think if we were to go back and examine that textbook or that guidebook you mentioned at the beginning, that might be how it would explain the problem in the Judeo-Christian worldview, as they view a problem, which is that it centers everything on human beings and says we're special, when according to a more naturalistic outlook, we're not special. We are, in fact, just one species of mammalian megafauna that has outgrown its ecological niche catastrophically and is now running rampant all over the earth. So, yeah, talk to us about what that means and what your sense is of whether humans should be in the center in our view of creation.
Yeah, I think a pinnacle of creation and a center of creation are two very different things. And I do believe that humans are inherently anthropocentric, which is why Jesus came to save us from ourselves. Anthropocentrism is never a good thing in a philosophy. I mean, the outworkings of anthropocentrism are terrible. Greed, avarice, disregard, apathy. And so I think Jesus came as the antithesis to anthropocentrism in a beautiful way by making himself the least, by dying on a cross as a humble servant who was also Lord of all, King of kings. And so here we are now living in this world as Christians, supposed to be salt and light, but we keep turning around and putting ourselves at the center again. And I think we've definitely done that in the environmental way, which is why Lynn White wrote a really famous paper I would think it was like late 60s or something. This is early on in the environmental movement, saying that Christianity was the cause of our ecological crisis. And he cites the fact that Christianity is anthropocentric in nature as his main thesis. So he said Christianity is all about, people get to do whatever they want, the earth belongs to them, and therefore this is why we're having an environmental problem. And the theologian Alistair McGrath responded to him beautifully and said that Lynn White was completely right when he said anthropocentrism was the reason for our ecological crisis, and completely wrong when he assessed Christianity as being an anthropocentric religion. He said it's not. So I think you might find Christians who do think that humans are at the center, but when you look at our example, Jesus Christ, you see a person who put others before himself, who went to the least, who went to those who were lost and forgotten, and told parables that evened the playing field, and pointed everything back to God. So I think we make ourselves too large in our minds. And again, I think this is where Christianity has a lot to say in the conversation, because as a society, we have put ourselves at the center. Look at how much waste we're creating. Look at how greedy we are being. I mean, the statistics are staggering. Waste is the number one problem in my mind right now. It's absolutely, in the American culture, I mean, specifically, it's basically an abomination. And it's because we are so greedy. And I think Christianity has something beautiful to offer of a selfless servant who would make sacrifices and be salt and light in a culture that is wasting away. And I think we have a really special opportunity in an anthropocentric moment to be the least anthropocentric people, to go out and wash the feet of others by staking our claim in the environmental movement and saying, you know what, I'm not going to throw away as much trash today. You know what, I'm going to go out and clean up my park. Not because I'm trying to make myself feel less guilty, but because I'm doing it as an act of worship to the Creator who owns this park. Ultimately, I don't own it. This is his world, and I want to do this as an act of love and worship. So those are my thoughts on anthropocentrism.
I think that there's an elephant in the room here when we're speaking from the Christian side that just does need to be addressed. And we've already alluded to it a couple times. It's this idea that we shouldn't care that much about the world, because the created world around us, because number one, it's going to burn up anyway, right? So there's this sort of, I guess you could almost call it a Gnostic assumption that eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we shall die, and so shall the earth. That's it. In that material existence is not really what matters. It's spiritual existence that matters. And then there's this other idea that goes along with that there's some kind of fundamental zero-sum opposition between the good of human beings and the good of the created world. And so we're in a tug of war. And that means, and I think many Christians do think this way, that means that whatever slack we give to the environment is something that people will pay the cost for. Like, people will be worse off because of the care given to the environment. And again, to steelman this, I understand where it's coming from, because historically, a great deal of the economic development, the growth in technology, the growth in population, the revolutions in agriculture and so forth have happened at the expense, to a large degree, of the environment, right? You knock down forest and prairie environments in order to create this monoculture of corn, as far as the eye can see. And that's what feeds people, right? You have to drill into the bottom of the ocean or into the land, wherever geologists find it, to get these fossil fuels out. And then you burn it and put it in the environment and, enter it in the carbon cycle and so forth. So there is a cost there, but I'm not sure it's as necessary as people think it is. Talk about those two assumptions, especially I think that big one, that this place is not going to last, and so we don't have to care. What's the problem with that line of thinking?
I think there are multiple problems with that line of thinking, but I think to truly address it at core, we need to go way, 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 way back to the proto-evangelium, way back in Genesis, when Adam and Eve have just fallen and God comes to tell them what's going to happen next. And in the proto-evangelium, which you can find in Genesis chapter 3, there are multiple relationships described. And we see ourselves being separated from God. We see ourselves being separated from each other. We see ourselves being separated from our own self. And we see ourselves being separated from nature. So there are these 4 broken relationships. And when Christ came, he came to restore all 4 of those, including our relationship with nature, because it has been broken, right? And it says in Genesis, thorns and thistles the earth will produce for you. You'll have to toil. It's not going to be easy. And we see this man versus nature. We've been living it. It's real. I mean, it's true. I spent so many hours yesterday pulling all the dandelions out of my front yard. And today I got home from work, and guess what was all over my front yard? More dandelions. So it's man versus nature, baby. Here it is.
Xandra, that's because you can't blow the little white flakes off of it while you're picking it.
I thought that's how you were supposed to get rid of it, Shane.
No, I know it's fun, but that's not how you do it. That's actually going to be counterproductive. Sorry.
I've been doing it wrong this whole time. Shoot. Well, anyway, my methodology may be slightly off there, but yes, man versus nature is a real thing that we encounter every time a bee stings you, or, bugs get into your garden, or the squirrel digs up all your lettuce or whatever. So yes, this is a broken relationship, but we have to remember it was not meant to be this way. God does not view his nature the way that we view it, as something to be hidden or conquered or killed or put away. He views it as something beloved. And there was a time when it was beloved to us as well. There was a time when the trees were like our closest friends, and the Lord would walk with us through the evening, in the cool of the day. And I just wonder what he spoke to Adam and Eve in those times. I wonder if he was teaching them about his love for his creation, and if we've forgotten it through the generations now. And that is something that I believe Christ wants to reawaken in us, because yes, he's going to restore all things, and that begins now. He will return another day to fully restore. He's going to fully restore us to God. He's fully going to restore us to ourselves, to each other in relationship, but he's also going to restore nature and restore our relationship to nature. It's going to be a beautiful reconciliation, and we see a picture of that in a lot of apocalyptic literature, like Isaiah and Ezekiel and Revelation. You see children who are playing with snakes and not being bit. And you see predators who are no longer killing other animals. They're eating vegetation. And everything has been restored to how it was meant to be before. So I think if we are seeing our world with the eyes of our Father, if we're seeing our world through a heavenly lens, we are not going to see nature as something that needs to be conquered and destroyed and thrown away and burned and whatever. We're going to see it as a long lost friend who we long for, that we want to reconcile with. That is God's heart for us, and that should be our heart for nature.
Yeah, and this is the point where you do get into controversial territory, because now you're not just talking about environmentalism, you're also talking about Christian eschatology. And it just so happens that Christian eschatology is kind of split 4 different ways in terms of what people think is going to happen, right? The study of the end times, of the last things scripturally. And the 4 views that you typically hear are amillennialism, postmillennialism, historic premillennialism, and dispensational premillennialism. And we're not going to go into those here, but I will just remark, because I think it's useful to point out, that the view that's typically informing comments like it's all going to burn up anyway is that last one, that dispensational premillennial view. And the surprising thing when you look at that view is you find out it's extremely recent. That's not a view that was held by Christian figures dating back for, like more than 1,500 years of the Christian church. It just wasn't heard of. It comes on the scene, I think in the 19th century is really when that begins to get propagated. And so Christian views on what's going to happen to us and this world have not always been informed by that set of assumptions, especially when you get into America in the 20th century. I mean, yeah, dispensationalism becomes the way of thinking about everything. And it is a very pessimistic prediction or understanding of what's going to happen to this world in the future. Not just this world, but in natural terms, but this world in human terms. All of the civilizations and cities and nations and all of those are essentially doomed to perish, and it's the church that's going to be raptured out. Now, we're not going to sit here and debate eschatology. I'm sure some of my listeners will hold that view, but I just want to point out that it's extremely recent, and it's not by any means the necessary or even historically the majority view among Christians. There are other ways to look at this that don't end in this sort of big fireball. And if you're looking for recommendation on possibly rethinking some of this stuff, I think the best book out there is still N.T. Wright's Surprised by Hope, because he's not really going to war with dispensationalism exactly, but what he does is challenges this assumption that so many people have that the physical world essentially is doomed and doesn't matter. He thinks it's due for resurrection, not due for destruction, and that our bodies are emblematic of the world itself in that way. So everything, in some sense, will be, we don't know how, but in some mysterious way will actually survive and be renewed and glorified. So I just want to put that little plug in there and acknowledge that there's something going on here, that we can name. We can put a name to it.
That's great, Shane. That's fascinating. Yeah.
I'm talking today with Xandra Carroll about Christians and the environment. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back after this. Upstream listeners, we're excited to announce Colson Center National Conference online for just $49. You can learn from Justin Bailey, Stephen Meyer, Briston Wagoner, and many more speakers from our annual Christian Worldview Conference. And if you use promo code Upstream, you can receive $5 off. That's promo code Upstream. For more information about this on-demand experience, visit colsonconference.org. We're back on Upstream talking with Xandra Carroll about whether God cares about the environment. Xandra, there is this indifferent attitude that we've been talking about toward the environment. And you said something in this podcast that sort of, or the podcast that prompted this discussion, right, that I was listening to, that really caught my attention. And you mentioned that the dismissiveness, it's all going to burn up anyway, so why care attitude, it doesn't seem to apply to anything except the environment. So you never hear Christians saying, it's all going to burn up anyway, so we shouldn't care about politics, or we shouldn't care about institutions, or we shouldn't care about the family, or we shouldn't care about our finances, or we shouldn't care about, art and beautiful buildings and and bringing, human dignity and beauty into the world. I mean, there are clearly goals that Christians are okay with pursuing that don't just amount to getting people on the lifeboat to heaven. why just the environment? What's going on there?
It's a wonderful question, and it's one that I've asked myself several times. And I'm ashamed to say to you, I don't know the answer, but I do have a hunch. And my hunch is that people are separate from the environment because people don't care about things that they don't often see. It's easy to forget the face of that neighbor down the street that you never go and visit. It's easy to forget how to play a violin if you put it away in the closet for years. And I think that many people are so far away from the environment, so far away from nature, that they don't remember what it sounds like and smells like and looks like. And so they've forgotten to care. It's not that people are being malicious or willfully ignorant a lot of times. I think it's just that people are very forgetful, and that can come out in ways that sound quite hurtful. But in my experience, I think, yeah, we've created these beautiful little pristine, I don't know, bluegrass on all of our lawns and paved streets. And
it's St. Augustine down here.
Yeah. Is it? I mean, a lot of us don't even know the bird calls of the native birds that live in our neighborhood because we're never outside.
Along those lines, there's this TikTok and Reels trend. Right? So I don't have TikTok on my phone. I watch like Facebook and Instagram Reels. So I see everything 2 weeks after the cool kids see it. But one of the trends is they'll post like a series of photos of a typical like 1990s to early 2000s suburban childhood, lots of outdoor stuff, right? And they'll have this kind of sad, nostalgic music. And then they'll have like a mourning dove, the call of a mourning dove. It's an iconic call. And they'll say, remember when the world was like this? And you're supposed to, I mean, I've seen it dozens of times. I'm not even kidding. And these things have like tens of thousands of views and likes. And I guess the idea is that you're supposed to be sad that the world is no longer like this. And the funny part is I'm often hearing a mourning dove while I'm watching this. It's just like, the world hasn't changed, guys. Just go outside, touch grass. You're not listening anymore because you're inside on your phone instead of out there enjoying the world.
Yeah, no, it's a great aside. And it's a good example. I mean, in the spring and summer times, I'll often post on Instagram, a picture of a beautiful butterfly or moth just sitting on my knee, just sunning herself or moving her, wings or whatever. And I'll, tell a little bit about the species or whatever. And I've had so many people reach out to me and say, how on earth do you get these butterflies to sit on you and hold still on your knee? And I just say, well, I just sit in the grass and I just wait. And they just come and land on me. It's, you don't have to catch it because there's this view that like, oh, nature is so elusive, you got to go out. And no, you just put yourself in it and there you are. And so I think, yeah, it's kind of funny that we're seeing nature through the digital now. We've forgotten the analog, and you can look at beautiful pictures of Instagram all day, but that doesn't mean you can smell the pine trees in a forest through Instagram, Not trying to bash Instagram. I'm just saying it's not the real world. So yeah, I think people have forgotten that, and myself included, because we are not living in a society that is conducive to becoming involved with nature. And let's face it, nature is uncomfortable. It's scary. I don't know if you've ever been lost for an extended time in the wilderness, but I have multiple times, and it's not comfortable.
My analog to that is I can't remember a time I've exactly been lost in the woods, but there have been moments scuba diving where there's this brief interval where I look around and go, I don't remember where the boat is. And then your heart just kind of explodes. And then fortunately, it's always quickly resolved for me because I'll catch sight of my buddy or something like that. But yeah, there's that feeling, and it if you've had it.
We are small, delicate creatures in a vast, fearful creation. And I think that's maybe why we avoid nature sometimes. It isn't comfortable. But again, I think we've lost a really special open door that's been offered to us for the sake of comfort. And stability. And I think nature is worth re-encountering and protecting and getting involved with. And again, this is where sometimes in the secular view, you've got to remove yourself from nature to preserve it. Because anytime you get human beings involved with nature, nature becomes not nature anymore. And I think that idea is completely preposterous. But again, this is maybe coming from my background as a reconciliation ecologist, which means I believe humans and nature should be together, should be integrated. And so, yes, people will either say in conservation, they'll say, well, you need to make it a reservation. So put a fence around it and keep people out, and therefore nature will be okay. Or they'll say, okay, well, humans can go in to restore the environment. So you go in and you do restoration, plant some trees, translocate some birds, and then you get out of there again. But reconciliation ecology, which is a field that was founded by a Christian man, I will add, believes that humans and nature can coexist together. It's complicated, it's messy, we're still learning a lot, but I believe it's the heart of God, and I believe it's something worth pursuing.
I spoke a while back with Matthew Sleeth, who has written a number of great books, but one of them is about trees. It's just about the theology of trees in the Bible. And he opens with this just amazing kind of observation. It's a test that he'll run on people, and he'll show them a bunch of different logos that consumers will know. So Nike or McDonald's or Chevy or something like that. And quiz them on how many they can name. Like, just based on this logo, what is the name of the company? And he said virtually everyone gets 100% on that quiz. And then he switches to a series of leaves, like pictures of leaves of common trees. And he asked, what are these? Which tree did this come from? And he said, pretty much everyone flunks that one miserably. They don't know what these different trees' leaves look like. And he says, how messed up is that? How displeasing, in a sense, to God must it be that we care more about our consumer symbols than we do about his beautiful creation? And this is something that probably wouldn't have been true in times past. I mean, there are applications beyond just appreciating trees for which you need to know which tree looks like what. You know, if you want maple syrup or the right kind of timber or something like that, you know, you've got to know the trees. And it was a great reminder, I think, of the fact that we've lost so much familiarity with God's world. And in a sense, I wonder if anyone can even be asked to care if they haven't encountered it. And so another guest of mine, Rick Lindroth, I had him on, and he talked about this experience that he tries to get people to have. Like, he takes them out. He volunteers his time and takes whoever wants to go out on this nature walk. And I think in his case, it's in New York somewhere. Could be wrong about that. And just shows them what's out there. Lets them get their hands dirty. Lets them smell those pine trees, like you're saying. Lets them hear those mourning doves that they never hear because they're inside on their phones all the time. And he said, without fail, there's a connection. Immediately, people say, oh, this is what it's about. This is what I'm talking about when I speak of preserving this stuff. It's not just a concept or a picture. It's real. It's alive. It's beautiful. And it makes me feel amazing to encounter it because, I don't know, maybe that's where you're supposed to be or something. But I just love that idea. I think there's something absolutely key there. That connection has to happen. And as long as you're cut off from the natural world, you will not care about it.
Yeah, E.O. Wilson wrote often that the greatest way to have people get more connected with nature again is the simple practice of biophilia, which is just falling in love with nature. And so it sounds like your guest was basically doing that. You know, he was inviting people out to experience something that they of course loved. And I'm sure that all of those people wanted to go out again at some point. So that's really special.
So along these lines, you've got a project that you're working on that embodies this idea that people should encounter and see the glory of God's creation in order to care about it. So tell us about the Museum of Beauty. This is a fascinating idea, and I'd love to see it come to fruition and be just incredibly popular.
Yeah, thank you for allowing me that little shameless plug here. So I like that you mentioned earlier that A lot of people just spend so much time on Instagram looking at pictures of stuff, but they don't actually see them in the real world. And part of the heart behind the Museum of Beauty is leveraging the digital to point people back to the analog, because there are so many young people who don't know the beautiful things that exist all around them right now that are creeping and crawling around their house and seeing from the trees and whatever else. I mean, fascinating creation. So it's a completely digital museum. There are 100 rooms, and it moves from the macrocosm to the microcosm. So it starts with, nebula and galaxies and galactic clusters and planetary systems and all these things. And then it moves down into the midicosm, which is the world that you and I can see with our naked eyes. And, birds, bees, orchids, cacti, migrations, things like that. And then all the way down to the microcosm, things you can only see with a microscope, like these beautiful, graceful diatoms, single-celled algae that just look like these tiny living jewels in the water, and everything in between, snowflakes, lions, whatever. It's the most beautiful things that we have discovered thus far. And it's a showcase of created beauty. So as I mentioned before, part of this heart is to draw people back to the beauty of creation. But another part of it is just to offer an encounter with the Creator. And we are hoping that, I am convinced, as a Christian apologist who has spoken on campuses all over the world, that this next up and coming generation does not need a bunch of arguments to lead them towards God. And I love a good argument. I'm a Christian apologist, right? But I think people are looking for an experience. They're looking for something emotional, which I'm not always comfortable with, but I'm willing to go take the gospel how it needs to go and be all things to all people, as Paul said. And I think that people are wanting an encounter with beauty. They're wanting to feel something. They're wanting to experience something. And ultimately, we pray that this experience of beauty will lead them back to the Creator and just ask, who made this? This is incredible. There has to be more. I was speaking with a friend of mine who studied art in college, and she had a really good friend who was dyed-in-the-wool atheist, just very staunch atheist. And she kept praying about how to share the gospel with her friend, and nothing really seemed to be working. So she kind of gave up the point. And one day they were in class and they were working on still lifes. I think they were doing oil paintings. And there was this beautiful arrangement of flowers at the center of the room. And all the students, of course, were around it in a circle. And my friend Meg is there painting. And she looks to her side and realizes that her friend has broken down and is crying. She's weeping profusely. And Meg said to her, "What's wrong? Are you okay? Why are you crying?" And her friend said, "God is real. God is real." It was in that moment when she was encountering the beauty of those flowers, just a simple still life, a simple class exercise, doing art. And it hit her that this experience of beauty brought her to the feet of Jesus. And ultimately, she became a Christian and she gave her life to Christ. And so I believe that beauty is the most powerful apologetic for this next up and coming generation. I'm really hoping that the Lord uses it.
You can see that in so many people's stories, the way they tell of the promptings that brought them to the end of their worldview, I guess. And it's you can hear it also in the lyrics of a song like, so Andrew Peterson's one of my favorite musicians. My family loves his stuff. He's got this song called "Don't You Want to Thank Someone," and it is, it's so beautiful. But he starts with asking. He's like, "Look around. You see all the beauty, the thunder rolls and the baby sighs and the rain comes down." And he says, "Don't you want to thank someone for this?" There's this impulse of gratitude. It's like, I want to give thanks. Well, to who exactly? Maybe you were designed to do that. And then he works through basically almost like a theology of creation there, of creation and fall and redemption, and says, there is somebody to thank, and I know his name. And then he ends with this number. It's like the music completely changes. It gets really mysterious, and he starts singing about the world being charged with glory, and just behind the veil of wind, there's a million angels waiting in the wings. I'll just sit here and quote the whole thing if I let myself. But yeah, that's exactly what you're talking about, that apologetic of beauty. And boy, does it hit people between the eyes in a way that the apologetic arguments don't always do. I mean, there's some people who will be argued into the faith in a sense, at least humanly speaking, but not everybody. And I think I think you're right when you say that this generation, this younger generation, is more susceptible to the argument from beauty than they are to the arguments from, say, contingency or God being the prime mover or something like that. Aquinas' 5 ways. That's okay. That's all right.
And like you said, it works for a lot of people. And I think, for our parents' generation, it was probably more that way. And that's great. But apologetics is organic. It's moving and changing. And that's the beauty of it, is it's a tool that can be used in any culture, in any context, at any time. And, a lot of us are just prayerfully seeking the Lord on how do we reach the next generation of people for you? What is going to lead them to the cross? And I like that you mentioned gratitude, because a friend of mine in New Zealand during my master's degree had been a Christian. He was raised Christian and had converted to atheism and was constantly trying to save me from my Christianity during grad school, constantly trying to convert me to atheism. But he did say to me one time that he missed God. And when he walked through the forest, he didn't have anyone to thank. And that made him sad. And I've always remembered that.
I can't imagine not having someone to thank for it. And you see in naturalistic worldviews, and this is where we get down to the foundations of things, and why that textbook you mentioned at the beginning is dead wrong. Because Christianity is the worldview that allows you to look around at all this beauty and see the wonder of it all, and be moved to the very edge of, a sense of transcendence by it, and say, I see it, I get it, I appreciate it because I was meant to. My eyes were meant to behold it. My ears were meant to hear it. My hands were meant to hold it. And I know who to thank for it. You see when you hear a naturalist try to talk about this stuff, often they'll revert to almost a criticism or a downplaying of it. That terrible impulse where they try to talk about bad design or something being stupid or ugly or just inefficient or something like that. It's the impulse to criticize the natural world. Why? Because if you view it as an accident, of course you got to criticize it. You got to see it as essentially meaningless and stupid. But that's not. I mean, I cannot think of a more inimical attitude to true appreciation and preservation of the environment than that. It's clear to me that Christianity provides the framework we need to actually care. We're coming to the end of our time here, and I do want to. We've skirted it by a number of landmines, but there's one that I think we probably ought to mention at least, because many of my listeners are going to be hearing all this and thinking, okay, in general terms, that's great, but what about specifics? Okay, so what about when I hear politicians getting up and railing about climate change or something like that? And I think you and I both have views on this, and they're not going to be the views of some of my listeners. So help us understand the right questions to ask, at least. So if you hear talk of the ice caps melting or something like that, and you think, oh, that's just more of that environment worship ideology or panic driven catastrophism by the left or whatever, what are some good questions to ask to get to the truth instead of being snookered by your own presuppositions and ideology?
I love that. Wow, I so appreciate that question, Shane. It does seem like, this conversation is polarizing. And I know a lot of people listening right now might even be a little bit riled up one way or the other, saying, yeah, or saying, no, this is terrible. And I think it's difficult to talk about this because it often becomes a question of, are you with us or with them? And we've stopped talking about these important things because we're slogging through all of this political talk, trying to be gracious here. And so I think a lot of people ask, how can I do things differently from the people I disagree with? That's the wrong question. The question should be, how can I do the right thing in the right way? Period. And if it makes me look a little bit like someone I disagree with, it doesn't matter, because I'm asking about how can I do the right thing in the right way. So if there is someone out there who does not believe in climate change, that's fine. There are other things you can do to protect the environment. How much trash are you throwing away every day? Or what kind of attitude do you have about the environment? What are you doing in your house? What does your backyard look like? Are you planting some flowers that maybe some of the bees can use? There are so many things that we can do and so many questions that we can ask. So I always say, like, there are 3 things that I cry about as the conservationist, WAH, waste, attitude, and habitat. And those are the 3 things that you and I have total control over. I have total control over what I'm throwing away in my garbage bin and how much. I have total control over my attitude, and I have total control over what I'm doing with my habitat, with my house or my car or whatever. And we can worship God and honor God through those things. So I think asking questions around those 3 things would be helpful, and also knowing what are we going to prioritize, because it is discouraging and you can't do it perfectly. People don't like to admit this, Shane, but you can't. You can't do it perfectly. Maybe I am really concerned about the habitat and I want to use as little land as possible. So I'm going to eat a part vegetarian, part omnivorous diet, and I'm going to buy eggs that are from chickens who live in tiny cages in terrible conditions because they use the least amount of land. But on the other hand, if I'm going to be ethical, I'm going to want to buy eggs from chickens that are free range, that get to run all through their pasture raised, right? But that takes a lot of land. So you've got to balance. You've got to prayerfully balance being efficient, being economical, being ethical. And it isn't straightforward, and there is no perfect way. But I think at the end of the day, the one question I want on the heart of every single one of us, brothers and sisters in the faith, is how can I care? Am I caring right now? I want us to be known as the people who care. The people who care about each other, and the people who care about all the big questions that are facing our society today. Let us care. Let us not be disillusioned or ignorant or just turn a blind eye and say, it doesn't matter, the Lord's going to come back any moment. We were put on this earth to be salt and light, Shane. And the question is, how do we do that at our environmental moment of crisis right now?
Couldn't have said it better. The focus there on the foundational questions is so important, because when you get to a subject like climate change, like I said, I take the science at essentially face value on the question. I do think there is a real problem that's happening. It's not fake. And we can probably do some things to change the situation. They may not be comfortable things. But when you're talking about the issue of the environment as a whole, it's multifaceted. And one of my criticisms of the mainstream environmentalist movement is that they have allowed climate change to suck all the air out of the room and become the issue, the only thing that really matters. And it's like the altar call at the end of every documentary, at the end of every presentation. You can't even appreciate footage of an animal and its environment without there being some sort of, sob sequence at the end about how climate change is going to destroy all this. And I get it. Fine. It's literally a global problem. Global problems have global effects, and that means everybody feels it in some way or another. But the fact is, for micro conservation, if you want to zoom in to the individual problems, there are so many things that are so much more practical to act on a small scale, like a individual scale or community scale or even national or something like that can make an enormous difference. And, living in Florida has made me especially conscious of that, because Florida has been this environmental battleground since the moment that people of European descent set foot on the state and said, this place is too swampy. We gotta drain it so we can build stuff, right? There's a great book about that, by the way, by Michael Grunwald. It's called The Swamp. Highly recommend that read for anybody who wants to understand the ecology of Florida. But that's neither here nor there. I think that point is fantastic, that we have to ask the right questions on a foundational level in order not only to avoid being self-deceived, but also to avoid losing sight of the things we can actually do. in our own lives, because I see people who really get concerned about climate change, for instance. I see them getting paralyzed by it, secular and Christian. They just think there's nothing I can do because it's a problem that's on such a vast scale that involves nations and whole economic systems. I can't do anything, so might as well just despair. Well, no, you can stop using so much plastic. you can support efforts privately and publicly to conserve land. You can change the way that water is used in your city. Any number of things like that. But the idea that those are conversations Christians can be having, that strikes a lot of people as new. And that's exactly why I wanted to have this conversation with you today.
Yeah. Well, I've really enjoyed it. And, as we're coming here to the end of our conversation, I'm reflecting on the words in the scriptures that say, we do grieve, but not as those who have no hope. And I think that is a powerful message for us today because, as you do say, Shane, it's overwhelming. And sometimes it feels like no matter what you try to do, it's not going to be enough. So why even try? But we serve a God who sees our heart, sees our motivation, and sees our acts of worship. And, every small decision we make of, taking a mug to work instead of using all the plastic coffee cups over and over again. I mean, that small thing can be an act of worship for the Lord that can delight his heart. And I think it's an exciting time for Christians to look different than a lot of people in America. And again, be that agent that cares, be that people group that actually tries to do things differently for the sake of love, not for the sake of guilt or self-preservation, but because we serve a God that we love, and this all ultimately belongs to him.
Amen. Well, my guest today has been Xandra Carroll, speaker, author, and Christian voice on biology and the environment. Xandra, thanks so much for joining me on Upstream. This was an important conversation to have.
Thank you, Shane.
Upstream is a program of the Colson Center. When it comes to the hardest questions we ask, we have thousands of years of accumulated wisdom from which to draw, from a faith that is the explanation of all reality. So come upstream and learn to understand the world, the church, and the God who has placed you in them. Be sure to rate the podcast and subscribe in your listening app. You can also connect with us on social media and find more resources at upstream.colsoncenter.org.